Much for that. Let's bring in David Susi. He's a CNN safety analyst and former FAA safety inspector. When we look at this flight path that this plane took, David, I wonder if you can speak to the possibilities here, because at a certain point it makes a turn left heading back to the airport, and it almost gets there, right? It almost gets there, but then has difficulty landing, which obviously is quite a complicated process when it does come to flying a plane. But what kinds of things have you seen before where a plane gets almost all the way back to the field only for something like this to happen?
Well, there could be a couple of things going on, but before I speak to that, I wanted to talk about this particular airplane, which is 44 years old. But the aircraft, I've worked on these airplanes for many years, since the 80s. I've taken engines off. I've worked on this airplane inside and out. It's a very reliable, and as Pete mentioned, it's known for being easy to fly with the straight wing. So a couple of the things that you look at when it comes back around is how low it was coming back to the airport. It clearly was limping along in some manner. I don't think there was enough weather or interference with visual flight at that point to interfere with the visual approach to the airport, but it was clearly having a hard time maintaining that altitude. So that would relate to perhaps an engine failure of some kind. But again, this aircraft with the TFE 731 fan engines is perfectly capable of making that turn back on one engine and making a safe landing. So there's still a lot to be learned. But I think as far as this aircraft goes, it's a great aircraft. It's taken care of itself for a lot of years. The only one I was involved in is in 2006. There was an accident with one that I was involved with, but that was the only one, and it doesn't look like that was the same thing that happened here.
Notably, something that Pete mentioned earlier stuck with me as you were describing doing maintenance on aircraft like this one. He explained that these are fairly common, these Cessna Citations, and that when it comes to private jets, it's relatively affordable, though often because of their age, they require a lot of expensive maintenance. I wonder if you could speak to what is the most common type of maintenance that is necessary and what potential pitfalls there may be.
Well, some of the TFE 731 engines, as I mentioned before, have had some issues with the turbine blades, and those have had to be replaced and removed. But there's airworthiness directives and things that have improved that since then, which I'm certain this aircraft, with a new airworthiness certificate back in 2025, would have those upgrades. The biggest maintenance problem you're going to have with this aircraft is transitioning between what we call today a glass cockpit, and whether this aircraft had been upgraded to a glass cockpit. It's unlikely that it had, but at that point it makes difficult changing from a visual flight over to an instrument flight, especially during a takeoff. And there's been mention of this by the NTSB back in 2006 report about how difficult that can be in this aircraft. So those are the kinds of things maintenance-wise you would see with the airplane. But again, it's of course way too early to speculate, but those are the types of things I'd be looking for in the investigation at this point.
When you're having some kind of difficulty, whether it's an engine out or what have you with the plane, what kind of complications can that pose specifically upon landing, David? Can you speak to that?
Well, pilots are trained to make sure that they're flying the aircraft first. That's the first thing they need to do, is make sure they're flying. Communications even comes second to that. So in this particular aircraft, the S2, you can certify this airplane with one pilot. It doesn't have to have two. I'm not sure if this one had the STC for that or not, but it's likely that it did, where it's just a single pilot. So if you have some kind of confrontation, some kind of anomaly that happens in flight, you're there by yourself trying to fly this airplane, maintain communications, maintain separation, look visually around you to see if you're turning into someone coming on, especially in this airport, which is an uncontrolled airport where there's not somebody telling you, hey, you have traffic at this point or that point. You're on your own. You're out there visually trying to find and make sure that there's nothing else going on. So there's a lot on your plate. Maintaining altitude and flying the aircraft needs to be the number one thing. And the fact that he was able to make this turn and come back, I assume it was a he, I don't know who the pilot was at this point, but that they were able to come back and get at least lined up the way that they did, tells you that they were aware, they were cognizant of what's going on, but obviously it fell short and they weren't able to make that runway.
Just to pull on a thread of something you mentioned a moment ago, David, you were describing the likelihood or the potential for visibility to have been an issue, and just looking at this video, you see that the conditions are not great, but there's a good chance, you're saying, that it really didn't contribute?
Well, I'm not saying that there's a good chance. I'm saying that it may or may not have. But it would align with what the NTSB recommended back in 2006, that it's difficult to transition from visual into instrument just after takeoff. That's when there's a lot going on. You're trying to make sure you're clear, you're bringing gear up, you're bringing flaps up, you're making sure to stabilize the aircraft. At the same time, if you have to transition over to instrument conditions, which, looking at this gray area at this point, it could very well be that after takeoff, there needed to be some visualization, something that changed from just looking out to being instrument flights. So if they're transitioning, or if it was tried to be transitioned from that to the other, that's something that has been noted by the NTSB back in 2006, and there's been some mitigating actions taken by the FAA on the certification of this particular model of aircraft that have been implemented later in the later models of the S2 and the later models of the Cessna Citation.
One of many things, undoubtedly, that investigators will be looking at. David Soucy, we appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Thank you.